When the vice president's daughter tossed her dry cleaning receipt at me in the boardroom, she thought she was ordering around a nobody. She demanded her silk suit by 12 o'clock sharp. She did not know I was the only engineer keeping her father's billion-dollar empire from going completely dark. That suit would be the nicest thing she wore on the day her perfectly curated life shattered into a million pieces. And I was holding the hammer. Hello and welcome back to Boss Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube recently disabled monetization for our channel, leaving us with zero budget to keep operating. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or clicking the link in the description or pinned comment. Your kindness helps pay our hardworking team so they can afford their living expenses and continue bringing you these satisfying tales of corporate justice. My name is Mackenzie Cruz, and this is my story. The glass-walled executive boardroom on the top floor of Viridian Apex Dynamics offered a sweeping panoramic view of the downtown Oak Haven skyline in Texas. We were an energy and infrastructure titan, a massive, unyielding behemoth that kept the power grids humming for over half the state. Yet, inside this sleek, temperature-controlled sanctuary of corporate power, the air was thick with the suffocating stench of toxic vanity. Standing front and center at the head of the polished mahogany table was Chloe Vance. She was exactly 24 years old, fresh out of an elite luxury university entirely paid for by her father, who just happened to be the executive vice president of the company. Her newly invented, entirely fabricated title was Director of Visionary Innovation. It was a meaningless string of corporate jargon specifically designed to justify a massive six-figure salary. Currently, she was pacing gracefully in front of a massive smart screen, delivering a profoundly useless presentation titled Workplace Positive Energy Paradigms. She threw around hollow corporate buzzwords like holistic synergy, vibrational alignment, and dynamic wellness, while aggressively waving a silver laser pointer at a pastel-colored slide deck. I am 34 years old, on paper. My official title within the company registry is simply Operations Coordinator. I sat silently at the far corner of the massive table, actively blending into the shadows. I provided a stark, grounded contrast to Chloe's blindingly bright, theatrical performance, while the rest of the senior management team in the room pretended to be absolutely mesmerized by her every word. I was methodically writing down notes. I was certainly not taking notes on her vibrational productivity theories. I was meticulously documenting the severe, catastrophic technical deviations in her proposed infrastructure overhaul. Her pastel slides casually suggested rerouting critical cooling system budgets to fund mandatory meditation retreats for the executive suite. It was not just blindingly stupid, it was a critical failure of basic engineering logic that could lead to widespread blackouts. Suddenly, the relentless stream of buzzwords stopped dead. Chloe clicked off her laser pointer and let out a sharp, dramatic sigh, acting as if the immense burden of educating us was simply too much for her delicate shoulders to bear. Her meticulously mascaraed eyes scanned the large room and locked directly onto me in my quiet corner. The rhythmic, sharp clicking of her designer heels echoed aggressively against the glass walls as she marched directly toward my seat. Reaching into the pocket of her tailored designer blazer, she pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. With a flick of her wrist, she dropped a dry cleaning receipt directly onto my open notebook, perfectly covering my complex technical schematics. "Be useful, sweetie, and fetch my silk suit before 12 o'clock, Chloe commanded, her voice dripping with absolute, unfiltered condescension. "Don't wrinkle it." A heavy, suffocating silence instantly crashed over the entire boardroom. The circulated air grew stale and tense. 12 senior executives, powerful men and women who supposedly ran a multi-billion-dollar empire, collectively dropped their gazes down to their leather-bound legal pads. Not a single person dared to clear their throat, let alone speak up. Not one individual in that room was willing to defend a lowly operations coordinator and risk drawing the wrath of the executive vice president's precious daughter. They were nothing more than well-paid cowards hiding in expensive suits. Chloe stood there with her hip popped to one side, crossing her arms. She was waiting for me to flush red with embarrassment, or perhaps burst into frustrated, helpless tears. I gave her neither of those satisfactions. Instead, I looked up at her heavily contoured face and slowly smiled. It was a cold, completely empty smile that did not reach my eyes. I calmly picked up the small receipt, neatly folded it in half, and slid it into the breast pocket of my plain blazer. I stood up from my chair, calmly adjusted the lapels of my jacket, and walked out of the glass boardroom without uttering a single word. As the heavy oak and glass door clicked shut behind me, the invisible countdown to Chloe's absolute, humiliating ruin officially began. The elevator doors slid shut, cutting off the suffocating atmosphere of the executive floor. I rode the glass car down to the bustling main lobby, but I had absolutely no intention of stepping foot outside the building to fetch anyone's laundry. The crisp receipt was still resting lightly in my pocket. I scanned the chaotic floor and spotted a nervous-looking first-year intern desperately trying to balance a tray of artisan coffees. I stepped into his path, pulled the receipt from my blazer, and placed it on top of a stack of napkins on his tray, along with a crisp $50 bill. "Drop the coffees at the front desk," I told him, keeping my voice low and even. "Take this $50 bill. Go to the address on the slip and pick up the silk suit. Keep the change for your trouble. Just make sure it is delivered to the executive suite before 12 o'clock. He nodded frantically, his eyes wide at the sight of the cash. I turned on my heel and headed toward the restricted access elevators, swiping a black key card that very few people in the building even knew existed. I descended to the sub-level, far away from the natural light and the designer furniture. My workspace was not a glamorous corner office. It was a compact, highly secure reinforced room situated directly adjacent to the main server farm. The walls were completely covered in complex technical blueprints, thermal grid schematics, and dense electrical routing diagrams. This was the true brain of the corporation, and it was entirely my domain. The moment I sat down in my ergonomic chair, my primary monitor illuminated with a priority notification. It was an email from the Human Resources Department, flagged with high importance. I clicked it open and scanned the contents. It was a formal notice of corporate restructuring initiated directly by the newly appointed Director of Visionary Innovation. Chloe was not just satisfied with treating me like an errand girl in public. She wanted me completely out of her sight. The email stated that my role was being officially reclassified and demoted to event support staff. She was actively clearing out my position to make room on the payroll for her own circle of unqualified friends. I leaned back in my chair and let out a soft, genuine laugh. If Human Resources actually knew who they were sending that email to, the entire department would be having a collective panic attack. It was time to lay my cards on the table, at least in the privacy of my own mind. I was not a lowly paper pusher or an easily replaceable assistant. I am a master systems engineer. More importantly, I am the sole inventor and legal owner of the 2 core patents that operate the backup power regeneration systems for the entire state grid. Every single watt of emergency electricity that flowed through the region relied entirely on my proprietary architectural designs. Furthermore, because of the highly sensitive nature of the infrastructure, I was the absolute only individual in the entire corporation who possessed the active federal security clearance codes required to manage the grid. My unassuming title of Operations Coordinator was nothing more than a carefully constructed legal shell. It was a corporate smokescreen designed specifically by Viridian's legal team to bypass strict federal antitrust laws. The corporation could not legally own the patents while maintaining their regional monopoly, so they had to lease them directly from me. The massive, towering empire of Viridian Apex Dynamics did not employ me. In reality, their entire multi-billion-dollar operation existed solely because I signed a piece of paper authorizing them to use my technology. If I revoked that authorization, the company would collapse overnight. I closed the laughable email from Human Resources without bothering to type a single word in reply. Let Chloe plan her little events and assign her friends to empty desks. I had a much larger game to play. I turned my attention to the secondary monitor on my left. This terminal was not connected to the standard corporate network. It was a heavily encrypted, direct line interface. I authenticated my identity using a biometric scan and opened a secure communication protocol. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard as I drafted 3 brief, highly classified emails. The first message was routed directly to the State Department of Energy. The second was sent to the Internal Audit Division of the Cybersecurity Bureau. The third and final message bypassed all standard channels and landed directly on the private, secure server of the governor's office. I did not write long explanations or file formal complaints. I did not need to. The content of all 3 emails contained only one meticulously calculated, hidden message wrapped in standard compliance terminology. It read, "Critical system upgrade pending. Mandatory live federal audit and security verification required. Time of inspection, noon this Friday. Location Veridian headquarters." I hit send. The trap was officially set. The gears of government oversight were now silently turning, accelerating directly toward a collision course with Chloe's fragile ego. All I had to do now was wait for the sun to rise on Friday. The very next morning, a synchronized wave of overly designed digital invitations flooded every single inbox across the entire corporate network. Chloe was wasting absolutely no time cementing her imaginary legacy. The digital flyer, heavily saturated with emerald green graphics and glittering gold typography, announced the official Green Era kickoff press conference. It was aggressively scheduled for exactly 12 o'clock noon on Friday. However, she was not inviting established industry analysts, serious energy sector journalists, or state utility regulators. Instead, the highly curated guest list consisted almost entirely of local lifestyle bloggers, social media influencers, and vapid entertainment reporters. She was actively treating a critical infrastructure corporation like an exclusive nightclub opening, desperate to manufacture a viral moment to stroke her own fragile ego while completely ignoring the actual business of keeping the lights on. To fund this massive, unnecessary theatrical production, Chloe needed immediate liquid capital. Corporate protocol dictated that any expenditure exceeding a certain financial threshold required a direct signature from a senior director. As the newly crowned Director of Visionary Innovation, she now held that exact signatory power. This was her greatest operational vulnerability, and it was the precise entry point for my maneuver. Every successful heist relies heavily on the target's predictable behavior. Chloe's most predictable behavior was her absolute, arrogant refusal to read anything she deemed boring, technical, or financially dense. I accessed the central financial requisition system and carefully initiated a standard budget approval packet. On the surface, the thick stack of printed documents appeared to be nothing more than mundane vendor agreements for organic catering, exorbitant floral arrangements, and premium lighting rentals for her upcoming Friday spectacle. But meticulously buried on the 4th page of the dense, legally mandated paperwork was the payload. I had drafted a highly specific, aggressively binding corporate directive formally titled Obsolete Asset Liquidation. I buried the liquidation clause right beneath a line item requesting $50,000 for imported velvet stage curtains. The language of the directive was intentionally dense, wrapped in layers of exhausting operational jargon that I knew her perfectly manicured brain would instantly reject. I placed the packet in a sleek leather folder and handed it to one of her newly hired, terrified assistants. I watched through the glass walls of the executive suite as the assistant nervously placed the open folder on Chloe's desk. Chloe was intensely busy examining a fabric swatch for her stage backdrop. She did not even glance at the text. She simply grabbed her expensive fountain pen and aggressively scribbled her signature across the bottom line, authorizing the entire stack without a single second of hesitation. She had absolutely no idea what she had just done. With that single, careless stroke of her pen, Chloe had legally authorized the immediate wholesale liquidation of the company's entire Tier 1 backup generator fleet. These were not standard commercial batteries. These were massive, industrial-grade turbines housed in subterranean bunkers, designed exclusively to keep hospitals running and state communication lines open during a catastrophic blackout. She had essentially sold off the ultimate fail-safe for the state energy grid. listing them as scrap metal to instantly free up budget for her party. In the eyes of the federal government, selling off active critical infrastructure is not a simple bookkeeping error. It is a severe, unforgivable violation of national security. She had just handed me the legal equivalent of a live grenade with her own fingerprints pressed firmly onto the pin. The exact moment her digital signature registered in the central system, I moved to the next critical phase of the operation. I opened a highly secure encrypted communication channel directly to the tactical command center of the governor's security detail. I completely bypassed the standard public liaisons and connected straight to the senior tactical director. "We have a confirmed Tier 1 vulnerability event scheduled," I stated clearly into the microphone. "I am transmitting the complete structural schematics and security access routes for the Viridian headquarters right now." I hit a key, sending the heavily classified building blueprints straight to their encrypted servers. I formally requested them to execute a surprise, heavily armed inspection drill. Under strict state regulations, the governor's office was legally mandated to perform these extreme tactical drills immediately if there was any credible, documented risk of a catastrophic grid fracture. Chloe's newly signed liquidation order was the ultimate, undeniable proof of that exact risk. When I mentioned the unauthorized sale of the primary failsafes, the tone on the secure line shifted instantly from bureaucratic routine to absolute, cold alarm. The director confirmed the receipt of the files. I instructed the security detail to coordinate their tactical breach for exactly 12 o'clock noon on Friday. The trap was now completely locked into place. The invisible wires were pulled tight across the entire building, simply waiting for someone to trip them. Chloe was currently strutting through the corporate hallways, completely intoxicated by her own perceived brilliance, blissfully unaware that the ground beneath her designer shoes had already collapsed. She was eagerly preparing to step in front of flashing cameras on Friday at noon, to bask in the manufactured adoration of entertainment reporters. She fully expected to be crowned a visionary leader. Instead, she was about to be completely swallowed alive by a Category 5 political and legal hurricane, and there was absolutely nothing her powerful father could do to stop it. By Friday morning, the pristine, hyper-modern main lobby of the Viridian headquarters had been completely transformed into a high-budget, corporate-sponsored circus. The recklessly liquidated infrastructure funds were currently on full, absurd display, massive. Holographic backdrops projected giant floating leaves and cascading waterfalls across the imported marble walls. A dozen hired servers, dressed in matching beige linen outfits, wandered through the bewildered crowd carrying silver trays loaded with crystal glasses of artisan detox water infused with organic cucumber, crushed charcoal, and Himalayan sea salt. Standing right in the center of this ridiculous spectacle was Chloe. She was, of course, wearing the freshly dry-cleaned silk suit. It was pressed to absolute perfection, draping elegantly over her shoulders without a single wrinkle in sight. She held a custom-branded microphone, practically demanding that the captive audience of lifestyle influencers and minor internet celebrities drink their charcoal water while she lectured them about something she confidently called the healing energy of corporate synergy. I stood far away from the blinding ring lights and the flashing cameras. I was completely tucked away in a shadowed alcove near the rear emergency exits. Leaning comfortably against a cool stone pillar, I held a cheap, paper cup of bitter black cafeteria coffee in my hand. I took a slow sip, letting the harsh taste ground me as I coldly observed the aggressive vanity unfolding in the center of the room. It was a fascinating, deeply satisfying psychological experiment to watch someone so entirely consumed by their own manufactured importance, completely blind to the massive anvil hanging right above their head. The digital clock mounted above the polished reception desk silently flipped to exactly 11:45, right on schedule. The first subtle signs of the impending reality check began to bleed into the fantasy. It started at the heavy glass revolving doors at the front entrance. A highly coordinated team of individuals stepped into the lobby. They were not smiling influencers or vapid entertainment reporters. They were a dozen broad-shouldered men and women wearing crisp, unmarked black tactical suits. They all wore dark sunglasses and had transparent acoustic communication coils snaking down the backs of their thick necks. moving with terrifying, absolute military precision. They did not speak a single word to the reception staff. Instead, they seamlessly branched out across the expansive room. Within seconds, two agents physically locked down the main entrance, while the others took up strategic, immovable positions blocking every single elevator bank and emergency exit. Chloe, completely oblivious to the gravity of the situation, noticed the dark suits clashing violently with her carefully curated pastel color palette. She stopped her speech abruptly, her flawless smile twisting into a scowl of pure annoyance. She aggressively snapped her manicured fingers at her terrified assistant, who was hovering near the edge of the stage. "Who in the world are those people?" Chloe hissed, her voice echoing slightly over the microphone. "Did a rival agency send their muscle here to intimidate my guests? They are completely ruining the framing of my wide shots. Tell them to move out of the camera view right this second. They are entirely destroying the positive vibrational energy of my event." But while Chloe was throwing a childish tantrum over her camera angles, a very different scene was unfolding near the back of the lobby. Her father, the executive vice president, along with the rest of the senior board of directors, had gathered near the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the street below. The cheerful murmurs of the executives abruptly stopped. A heavy, sickening blanket of dread washed over the group. Down on the avenue, the hired entertainment bloggers were being aggressively pushed back onto the sidewalks by uniformed officers. Pulling directly onto the private corporate plaza was not a fleet of luxury sedans. It was a massive convoy of heavy-duty satellite communication trucks from the premier, hard-hitting political news networks. Directly behind them, heavy tires screeching against the pavement, came three matte black, heavily armored tactical response vehicles belonging to the State Security Bureau. Flashing red and blue emergency lights painted the pristine glass front of the Viridian building in the harsh, undeniable colors of a major law enforcement operation. Total, suffocating panic instantly gripped the senior leadership. The vice president pressed his trembling hands against the cold glass, his perfectly tanned face suddenly turning the color of wet ash. The executives began frantically whispering to each other, wildly pulling out their phones to call their legal teams, only to realize all at once that the tactical agents had already sealed the exits. The corporate castle was fully surrounded, the trap was definitively sprung, and the clueless princess was still standing on stage complaining about her lighting. The digital clock mounted high above the reception desk silently rolled over to exactly 12 o'clock noon. At that precise second, the massive, reinforced glass doors of the main entrance did not simply open. They were aggressively forced apart by the tactical team. The heavy rhythmic thud of combat boots echoed across the marble floor as state troopers secured a wide perimeter. Striding right through the center of this heavily armed formation was the governor of the state, his expression carved from absolute stone. Flanking his right side was the stern, uncompromising director of the State Department of Energy. Trailing immediately behind them was a relentless swarm of legitimate political journalists and Capitol reporters. The blinding, rapid-fire bursts of their camera flashes instantly overpowered the soft, aesthetic lighting of the corporate event. Chloe, completely blinded by her own towering delusion, genuinely believed this was the ultimate validation of her manufactured brilliance. In her mind, the highest-ranking official in the state had personally arrived to attend her Green Era kickoff. She hastily shoved her terrified assistant aside, smoothed down the front of her freshly pressed silk suit, and marched directly into the path of the approaching delegation. She plastered a massive, aggressively bright corporate smile across her face and thrust her hand forward. "Governor, welcome to our sanctuary of synergy," Chloe announced loudly, making sure projecting her voice for the trailing cameras. "I am Chloe Vance, the Director of Visionary Innovation. It is an absolute honor to have you attend my—" The governor did not even blink. He did not slow his pace by a single fraction of a second. He did not look at her perfectly manicured hand, nor did he acknowledge her fabricated title. He simply walked straight past her, his broad shoulder brushing past her silk sleeve as if she were completely invisible, leaving her hand suspended awkwardly in the empty air. the heavy crowd of reporters and tactical agents followed his exact path, physically shoving Chloe to the side of her own stage. Her smile shattered instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, uncomprehending shock. The governor ignored the elaborate stage, the expensive holographic waterfalls, and the crowd of confused lifestyle influencers. His eyes scanned the expansive lobby with intense purpose until they locked onto the dark, shadowed alcove near the emergency exits. He marched straight toward my corner. As he approached, I slowly stepped out of the shadows. Tossing my empty paper coffee cup into a nearby recycling bin, I stood up straight, meeting his gaze evenly. The entire lobby, filled with hundreds of people, fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The only sound was the rapid clicking of camera shutters. To the absolute horror and utter bewilderment of the entire senior board of directors watching from across the room, the most powerful political figure in the state stopped directly in front of me. He planted his feet, looked me right in the eyes, and then he bowed his head. It was not a polite nod. It was a deep, deliberate bow of absolute, undeniable respect. "Ms. Cruz," the governor's voice boomed, rich and commanding, echoing flawlessly off the high marble walls. "On behalf of the millions of citizens across this entire state, I am here to personally thank you. Your decisive action to activate the emergency grid rescue protocols last night prevented a catastrophic, cascading failure of our infrastructure." A collective, audible gasp ripped through the ranks of the executive board. The vice president, Chloe's father, physically stumbled backward, his back hitting the cold glass of the window. The governor turned slightly to face the swarm of reporters, gesturing respectfully toward me. "Let the record show that the state's multi-billion-dollar energy contract is not, and has never been, legally bound to the Viridian Apex Dynamics Corporation. The sovereignty of our power grid rests entirely on the intellectual property and the personal authorization signature of the sole patent holder standing right here, Mackenzie Cruz." The truth detonated in the center of the room like a tactical strike. The impenetrable armor of the corporation was instantly stripped away in front of the press, revealing that their entire empire was entirely dependent on the quiet woman they had shoved into a basement office. Chloe, desperately trying to salvage the rapidly disintegrating illusion of her authority, scrambled forward. Her voice was trembling, high-pitched, and frantic. "Excuse me, there is a massive misunderstanding here. I am the director. She is just an operations coordinator. You need to speak to my father, the executive vice president." The director of the Department of Energy stepped forward, completely blocking Chloe from reaching the governor. His face was a mask of pure bureaucratic disgust. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, legally stamped file. It was the exact financial packet she had signed less than 24 hours ago. "Which one of you is Chloe Vance?" the director barked, his voice laced with cold fury. Chloe swallowed hard, her artificial confidence completely evaporating. "I am..." The director held the document high in the air for every single news camera to capture. "Did you, directly under your own signature, authorize a federally binding liquidation order? Did you just legally sell off the state's Tier 1 grid security infrastructure to a scrap metal vendor in exchange for organic catering and party funds?" Chloe opened her mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. The realization of what she had signed finally crashed into her heavily contoured face. Every single camera lens in the massive lobby pivoted in perfect unison, pointing directly at her. The merciless, blinding flashes illuminated her pale, completely bloodless face. She looked like a deer caught in the headlights of a speeding freight train. In the background, perfectly framed by the cameras, her powerful father was clutching his chest, physically shaking as the billion-dollar empire he had built on my genius crumbled to dust in a matter of seconds. The chaotic storm of flashing cameras and shouting reporters eventually subsided. Within an hour, the governor and his massive security detail escorted the press out of the heavily guarded building. Before the governor departed, right there in the decimated lobby, he produced a new, legally binding state contract. I did not sign it on behalf of Viridian Apex Dynamics. I signed the multi-billion-dollar agreement directly under the name of my own private engineering firm, with a single stroke of my pen. Viridian was officially stripped of its total control over the regional technology. The aftermath forced us all back up to the top floor, the executive glass boardroom. The exact same room where this entire countdown began was now as silent as an open grave. The heavy mahogany table felt vast and empty. The executive vice president, Chloe's father, was pacing erratically near the windows. His face was a dark, dangerous shade of purple. Desperation made him reckless. He slammed his fist down on the polished wood and pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "You think you can just steal my company's intellectual property and walk away?" he snarled, his voice cracking with panicked rage. "I will tie you up in corporate litigation for the rest of your natural life. I will bury you in so many legal fees that you will be begging to fetch my daughter's coffee." Before I could even open my mouth to respond, the chief executive officer of Viridian stood up from the far end of the table. He was a ruthless, deeply pragmatic man who only cared about corporate survival. "Shut your mouth right now," the chief executive officer snapped, his voice slicing through the vice president's pathetic threats like a razor. "She does not need to steal anything. She owns the patents. We are completely at her mercy. If she walks out of that door, our stock price hits absolute zero by the time the market opens on Monday." The chief executive officer turned his gaze to me. His eyes were wide with naked, unfiltered desperation. He completely discarded the vice president, practically begging me, "Mackenzie, please, tell us exactly what you want. Name your price. We can fix this." I ignored the panicked men for a moment. Instead, I slowly walked over to the side of the table where Chloe was slumped over. Her flawless makeup was completely ruined, running down her face in thick, dark streaks. She was sobbing uncontrollably into her folded arms, the expensive silk suit heaving with every ragged breath. I stopped right next to her and dropped a heavy, sealed federal audit file directly onto the table beside her head. The loud thud made her flinch violently. She slowly looked up at me, her eyes red and terrified. "The mandatory federal penalty for intentionally sabotaging national energy security is 10 years in a maximum security prison," I told her softly, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any sympathy. However, I spoke to the director of the Department of Energy before he left. I told him that you are not a domestic terrorist. I explained that you are simply an arrogant fool who does not know how to read basic financial reports. Because of my statement, you will not go to federal prison, but your career, your title, and your perfectly curated corporate life are completely finished. Chloe buried her face back into her arms, letting out a pathetic, broken wail. I turned my back on her and faced the chief executive officer. "Here is the restructuring plan," I announced, my voice carrying Patel absolute authority. "First, you will terminate the vice president and his daughter immediately. They are to be escorted out of this building by security before the hour is up. They receive absolutely no severance packages. Second, the vacant position of Chief Technology Officer now belongs to me, with full, unquestioned executive control over all engineering divisions." The entire board of directors sat in stunned, paralyzed silence. No one debated, no one asked for a vote. They knew they had absolutely no leverage. Slowly, the chief executive officer nodded his head in defeat. He reached out and silently pushed the massive, leather-bound head chair toward me. I walked over to the head of the table and sat down in the seat of power. I picked up a fresh cup of coffee, took a slow, satisfying sip, and reached into the breast pocket of my blazer. I pulled out the crumpled dry cleaning receipt. With a careless flick of my wrist, I tossed the wrinkled piece of paper across the polished mahogany table. It landed perfectly in front of Chloe's soon-to-be empty chair. True power never needs to shout or throw tantrums. It only needs to know exactly how to close the deal. The screen slowly fades to absolute black. Thank you so much for listening to my story until the very end. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please let me know your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story satisfying and want to help our channel survive without YouTube monetization, please consider supporting us with just $1. You can scan the PayPal QR code on your screen or use the link provided in the video description and pinned comment. Your generous contribution directly pays our hardworking staff, helping them feed their families and allowing us to keep creating more high-quality revenge stories for you to enjoy. Stay strong, know your worth, and we will see you in the next episode.